Hey everybody, welcome to Everyday Fi. I'm your host, Megan Combs, and I'm here to say that you do not need a $1 million book deal or a famous blog to reach financial independence. By exploring the lives of everyday people pursuing Fi, I'll show you how to forge your own path to financial freedom the everyday way. So today on the show, I wanted to deviate a little bit from my typical interview setup. I wanted to talk about a more urgent matter that came to my attention and is coming up at the end of the year. So if you guys are not aware, the ACA, or also known as the Affordable Care Act, the enhanced tax credits are going away December 31st, 2025, which is going to impact a lot of folks, a lot of them also in the FI community, because it's going to increase costs of healthcare pretty much immediately. So I've brought on Sam from the fire community who knows a lot about this topic. And some of you may have met him. He goes to a lot of the Camp Fi. And I've also brought on David Robinson, my go-to for anything financial independence, because he's my aspiring-CFP friend, and he'll give us strategies on what to do if the enhanced tax credits do in fact disappear at the end of the year. Before I introduce Sam and David, I'm going to let some advertisers play who, by the way, I do not choose and do not condone. All right, and we're back. Hey, Sam. Hey, David. Sam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, enjoying some good weather over here in Mexico.
Oh, that is nice being in Mexico. David, how are you doing?
I'm doing outstanding. No, this is the highlight of my day.
All right, cool. I'm going to jump right in, Sam. If you want to tell us a little bit about like why you know so much about the ACA first before we like launch into what's going on, just so people like know like why should I listen to this guy?
So I think it's a crazy story. So I should begin by saying I'm a mathematician by training, and I was in grad school a long time. I was in grad school in Iowa City and then later in New York City. Two cities that are a little different from each other, by the way. And one time I was in New York and I needed to visit a colleague in Iowa City. And things had changed in Iowa City since the previous time I'd been there. Before there had been taxis, and now suddenly there were Ubers everywhere. And I was very curious about Ubers. I didn't need to take them in New York because of the subway and all that. And well, I asked him all about his, are you saving for retirement? What are you doing for health insurance? Da, 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 da. I just asked him all these questions. And he told me a little bit about the Affordable Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare, and how there were some tax-related questions related to that he couldn't solve. And I thought, aha. But then he was like, well, if you're a mathematician, you can solve these problems. And I'm like, yeah, right. But of course, if I had a dollar for every person who thought a mathematician was the same as an accountant or a tax, expert, I would be, well, I've achieved financial independence real fast.
That's
But
a
yeah, but anyway, I told him, yes, I would look into his concerns, but I didn't take it all that seriously. But then I did look into it and say, well, there's actually some legitimate mathematical things happening in the underbelly of the calculations that go into Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. And I could actually look at some of these problems, write an academic paper, and maybe tell the IRS how to do taxes properly. So I ended up doing that. I ended up getting phone numbers of specific people in the IRS from my, congressional representatives and telling them, I gave them suggestions on how to improve their tax guidance and such. And I am now an urban legend in the IRS.
That's amazing. It's, being a mathematician, that helps. Yeah. So awesome. Thanks for that story. So I wanted to ask, just for people who maybe don't know, I don't know that many people listening to this show who self-select as like financial, will like to follow a financial podcast like this, don't know what the ACA is, but can we define what that is and what kind of people might be on that plan?
So I will say that the ACA is a pretty complicated law, first of all, and it does more than a single thing. One thing that it does is it basically creates a kind of marketplace for health insurance that meets certain minimum standards. And so every plan on there is going to meet certain minimum standards, which are laid out in the law and are kind of elaborate. And another important thing it does is it creates a new tax credit that you can receive early, and that is intended to make a lot of these plans more affordable for ordinary Americans, especially those who make too much money to be eligible for Medicaid in their state, but don't have what the government considers a high income. It does other things in addition, but those are the two main things that are worth focusing on.
Yeah, great. Okay. And David, what kind of person would probably be on the ACA or want to be on the ACA?
That's a great question. Yeah. So, and I'm not going to get into politics because this is, quite a controversial law, especially when it was being passed. It was very, very, controversial whether you're on the left or the right. Basically, before the Affordable Care Act, people that did not have insurance through their employers were kind of SOL, right? They didn't have a lot of choices. Plans were either unavailable to them altogether, just as an individual person, or if they were available, they were so prohibitively expensive that people just didn't sign up for them. So the healthcare system was very much a system of, hey, let's keep unhealthy people out of the system. So what the Affordable Care Act basically did is said, okay, for all the people out there who are not covered by their workplace plans, of course, it does a lot of other things too, but one of the things that it does is people who are not covered by workplace plans, whether they are retired and not yet on Social Security, Medicare, or maybe they're part-time or they're gig workers or whatever, or self-employed, that's a big one. They are able to go onto the marketplaces, through the national marketplace on the Affordable Care Act website, or through the state marketplace if the state established one, and select a plan, and they can just pay cash for that. And then, of course, in addition, potentially get a premium subsidy, if their income is low enough. So it's kind of a long way of saying the type of person that would select this is a person who is not getting health insurance through their employer or is not on a government plan like Medicaid or Medicare.
So the thing is, first of all, as David mentioned, there's going to be people who are not getting health insurance through a traditional employer, but may have some traditional employment. That's one big group. Then, of course, another big group are people who are self-employed and therefore are obviously not getting health insurance from an employer because they don't have a traditional employer. And I would say that those folks are at least twice as likely to be using Obamacare. I think there's a lot of statistics that basically said although there are fewer self-employed people than traditionally employed people, those self-employed people are in general much more likely to avail themselves of the Affordable Care Act. And finally, I want to mention a third group that's often overlooked, and that is people who are offered health insurance through their employer, but that health insurance is not affordable for them. Okay, the Affordable Care Act is for everyone who has no affordable health insurance option. And there's these, government calculations you can do to see if the health insurance offered to you by your employer is affordable. If it's not, then you can always get a tax credit from Obamacare in that case.
Yeah, that's great to know. And just to add my own little story to this, so when I was living in New York City, the city that David absolutely loves, sorry, inside joke. So when I was living there, obviously I was a student and then I was a part-time employee, which didn't get health insurance. Sometimes I was a gig worker because I did TaskRabbit, but then I also got a full-time job and I had, once the ACA passed, which was in 2010, I had marketplace insurance that entire time. And it was because I forget why I didn't do it through the school, have insurance through the school, but I think it was because I was under 26, so I was on my parents. So once I reached 26, that's when I got on the marketplace. And when I was a gig worker, I did that. When I was working part-time, I did that. And even when I worked full-time, the gallery I worked at was so small that their insurance plans, sure, they offered them, but they didn't subsidize any part of it. You had to pay full price. And they were like, I want to say $800 a month for a single person. And that was ridiculous. I could not afford that. So I decided to negotiate with them and I said, can I get on the ACA for $160 a month and you guys just pay it? And they said yes. And so I was lucky in that way. So I was definitely somebody who was on it for a very long time and it helped me a lot. So those are the kind of people if that's one of you guys, keep listening. Okay, so we talked about the tax credits. What is the enhanced tax credit that came along during COVID?
So before I say much about that, I do want to give the roughest of ideas of how the normal tax credit actually functions. What's the mechanism behind it? And essentially, what the government calculation does is, it is first figuring out how your income compares to the federal poverty line, like your income could be double or triple the multiple, which is the federal poverty line. And then from that, it gives a percentage of your income which is considered affordable for you. Of course, I should say that this is a government calculation that you may not personally agree as being affordable for you or not. But nevertheless, it exists as a calculation. Then what happens is there is a specific kind of benchmark plan on the marketplace for your county. And if that exceeds what's affordable for you to pay, again, according to the government, then the difference between those is your tax credit. So it's this pretty elaborate calculation where first there's a benchmark plan. And by the way, we live in this kind of semi-free market society. You don't have to choose that benchmark plan, okay? But it exists. And it has a certain cost, which may be quite high. And then there's the part that's considered affordable for you to pay. And then the rest, that's the amount, that's the original tax credit, okay? Now, what the enhanced tax credits do that were, codified into law during the pandemic times, they are essentially decreasing the percentage that is considered affordable for you to pay. In other words, before, maybe it was considered affordable for you to pay 9% of your income, say, just as an example, I pulled that number out of my ass. Maybe 9% was considered affordable for you to pay, and maybe now it might be 6% or 4.5% or some lower percentage. So that raises the tax credit because the amount that you're expected to contribute out of your income is considered lower. So that's the first way that the extended advanced premium tax credits function. The other difference is that the original Obamacare law is intended for people up to 4 times the federal poverty line in income. As soon as you're $1 over that, suddenly you're considered to not be in need of any assistance, magically. And so you don't get any tax credit, and any credit you did receive accidentally would have to be fully paid back. However, the extended tax credits are making that subsidy cliff go away. Essentially what happens is once you exceed 4 times the federal poverty line, they gradually phase out as your income gradually increases. So you still might get a little bit of money rather than suddenly jump down to 0 credit and have to pay everything yourself. So those are the 2 main additions or strengthening of it during this pandemic era legislation. And those are what might be going away soon.
Yeah, lovely. And so do you have an example? Like, Sam, you said you're on an ACA plan, right? And do you remember the difference in costs from prior to the enhanced tax credits and then afterwards? Like, trying to think of, and maybe David, you would know too. I'm trying to think if there's an example like of somebody who had it pre-enhanced tax credits, post-enhanced tax credits, and like what the difference in cost might be, just so they can be prepared of like what that jump is going to be for them, maybe. And I know that might be a hard question to answer, but maybe we can speculate.
Sure. Well, one thing is that, all this is heavily, heavily dependent on income, right? So it might be a larger change or a smaller change for people depending on what income, but basically mine is going to go up by about 66%, just as a good example. So for example, if it was $180 before, now it's $300. If it was $90 before, now it's $150. So that gives you the ballpark for me personally. But obviously, it could be a larger percentage or a smaller percentage for someone else.
Yeah, I think because the other thing that's happening too is that the cost of health insurance is going up simultaneously as these premium tax credits are going away. And so really what a person needs to do is just go to, Healthcare.gov and start pricing out plans, or if they have a state, marketplace, go in, put in their information and price out plans. It should be reflected on the website now with the expanded subsidies going away. So in other words, the price that they see for 2026 plans should be the price that they're actually going to pay.
Cool. And we'll put that link in the show notes just so that anybody can go and check it out and look. And so, okay, do you guys, I don't really understand what happened, like why these are going away. I'm guessing from what I understand from just like the minimal Googling I did, which is how I know anything, is just Googling stuff, and Google's AI is actually pretty good. But I basically saw that this was the enhanced tax credits came on during COVID because obviously COVID was like a time of a lot of people who would be on the ACA who didn't have work, gig workers, people who worked in restaurants, people who are Uber drivers, part-time workers, stuff like that, people who were in person and could no longer work in person. And so that was it was a certain amount of time that was allowed to be around, and now that is expiring. And I say that because I don't know like if it's a law, if it was like whatever, but basically it's expiring at the end of the year. And both sides, actually, there are mostly Democrats, some Republicans who are like, we need to figure out how to extend these because it's going to be a huge burden on people like almost immediately. It's not going to be a gradual thing. And so, what's happening? Why did this even happen? Why is it not being extended?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of it's politics. So, I mean, it is basically what you said, Megan. So back in 2021, the new administration in Congress passed another wave of COVID stimulus laws, right? I think it was the $1.9 trillion package. And a big part of that was basically putting these premium tax credits, or enhanced subsidies, I should say, into effect. In 2022, there was a law passed called the Inflation Reduction Act, right? And that basically extended these out through 2025. So that's the existing law, right? For the next, it's December 14th. So for the next 17 days, that is still the law, right? However, just like many things that pass, that are only temporary until they get extended or until they get made permanent, this did not get, they did not pass new legislation to extend this. This happens all the time with tax laws. Like the Bush tax cuts were temporary, and then the Obama administration made them permanent. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the tax rates were temporary through 2025 until they passed the One Big Beautiful Bill, which has made it completely permanent. Unfortunately, this did not get made permanent, and that's a big part of it is just partisan politics, unfortunately, right? It's just how it is. And I mean, the other part is that it is quite expensive. You know what I mean? And I'm not trying to get on one side of the political aisle or the other, but I think that a lot of the politicians on the right really did think that they would be able to rally enough support, on their side to pass a new law and kind of bring this back. But it does not look like that's going to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Cool. Thank you. Okay. So by the end of the year, these might be going away. People's insurance might be going up by quite a lot. David, is there anything people can do who are currently on these plans and financially independent, like they've fired already, and they use this as part of their calculation? This is what told them that they could do this. So I want to ask what they can do to kind of help with this. But first, I want to ask, because we knew this was temporary, should people maybe rethink planning around temporary laws and only plan around what is, permanent, like you just said? And the reason why I ask that is so I'll give a little bit of context here. When I refinanced my student loans, which I know is different than this, a lot of people were like, well, Biden is going to be passing the forgiveness stuff, don't you want to wait until that happens? And I was like, I never want to wait for the government to do anything. I don't trust that they're going to do anything because of this, two sides of, we're so polarized, right? And nobody can ever make a freaking decision in Congress. And I was like, I don't want to wait for them to do anything. The interest rates are really low right now. What I do know is that they're going to be going up soon, and I don't want to wait. And this is, the control that I have. And so I know that this is something it's so complex that I didn't even know that these tax subsidies or tax credits were not permanent. So I did not know that. And I don't want to sit here and say that people should have known that. But it does sound like, when you're doing planning for financial independence or quitting your job, it might be a good idea to potentially look at some of these things and say, okay, will this ever go away? Could this go away? And if it does, how do I need to plan for that? So yeah, just wanted to ask your thoughts there. And Sam, you can also chime in too if you would like.
So Megan, let me ask you, when that last part when you said, will this ever go away? Do you mean the Affordable Care Act in general, or
the enhanced subsidies or the enhanced tax credits?
Well, so yeah, that's a good question. The enhanced tax credits are going away, right? I mean, again, December 31st, that's the last day. Congress could write some new law in the next 2 weeks, but I mean, it just does not look like that. So unfortunately, the people listening to this, unless you log into the news and you see that they passed a new law, you should plan for January 1st, your tax credits going down, unfortunately.
And so what I'm asking is during COVID, when these were passed and people were planning for their financial independence, their RE date, and it was after this, should they have considered the fact that this was not a permanent law when they were planning?
I don't know about that. What I'll say is that people in the fire community who have already, retired, they have a lot more control over their taxable income. And Megan, you and I talked about that in a previous episode. So I think that, two things kind of benefit them in this whole kind of crappy situation. One is that they have a lot more control over what their modified adjusted gross income is, which is what, determines your subsidy amount. The other thing is that, frankly, they have a lot of money, right? Nobody likes to pay higher healthcare costs. Nobody likes to get less of a credit or whatever from the government. But generally speaking, the people in the fire community, some people are sitting on literally millions of dollars. And so as much as we don't want to pay that extra amount, they can often afford it. And every person's numbers are going to be different. So what I would encourage people to do is just run the numbers, look at what the subsidy is potentially going to be decreasing by and what your healthcare costs between the premium that you pay as well as for expected out-of-pocket expenses and everything. Look at what those are and add that in as a budget line item. What you'll often find is that this is not going to derail your fire plan, right? You still have enough to live. Nobody wants to pay more money for anything, but I mean, it's kind of like if your property taxes went up, that's probably not going to derail your fire plan in the same way as this won't. So, as for the question, should they have, adjusted their fire plan, expecting these credits to go away? I don't think so. I think that just like you said before, you have to kind of operate based off the best information that you have at that time. And frankly, yeah, the reality is that a person who maybe their numbers were relatively thin back in 2021, if they pulled the trigger and fired, at the same time as these enhanced subsidies are going away, the stock market has like nearly doubled in that time. So their numbers are even stronger now than they were when they fired. So they're probably still in okay shape. And I hope that people listening, because I know that like this is like kind of an emotional issue for a lot of people, and it's scary to see your healthcare costs go up. But I would say if you're in the fire community, run your numbers, see if this is really going to derail you. I think that generally speaking, it probably won't. And you have a lot more control than the average person, say a self employed person, to really control your income. And we can kind of talk about some of those methods later on in the show.
Yeah, for sure. Sam, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that in general, as David said, you want to plan based on the best information you have at the time. But if I had retired in, say, 2021 or 2022 based on an assumption that these would stay, I would probably be okay right now. On the other hand, I think someone retiring this year would probably have had a clue that this might be going away at the end of the year. And in that case, if someone is retiring this year, they probably should make some plans to the effect that it might be going up.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do know somebody, in the local FI group that I'm in Raleigh, Durham, that I think his premiums are going to be going up quite a bit, but it's because he has a family. And so I think that's where it's hard. Like, even if you have a bunch of money, if it goes up 66% and you're, say, paying, $500, $600 a month because you have a family of 4, 5, 6, you've got kids, and it goes up 66%, like that's a lot. That's a lot that it's going up. And yeah, you might have a lot of money, but it's also like, okay, now you aren't able to live the lifestyle that you planned for yourself. So yeah, David, what can we do? Is there anything we can do to kind of like head this off or help with this at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main thing is going to be reducing your modified adjusted gross income. And I'll kind of define what that is because I know a lot of times when people see, that word or MAGI, they're like, well, what the hell does that mean? Right. So modified adjusted gross income, depending on what government program or what government, tax credit you're talking about, it's your AGI plus some other things taken into consideration. So for this particular calculation for MAGI, it's your AGI plus any untaxed Social Security benefits that you get, plus any interest that you get from tax exempt sources. So like municipal bonds, things like that. So if you guys don't know, you might be age 62, not yet Medicare age, getting Social Security, and maybe your income is low enough that none of your Social Security is taxed or part of it is untaxed. Well, they're going to feed that back into your modified adjusted gross income to determine your subsidy for this. So anyway, that's a long tangent to say it's determined by your MAGI. So you have to look at things that are going to lower your MAGI. Okay. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing because there are things called above the line deductions, which are things that are taken into account before your adjusted gross income is calculated. And then there are below the line deductions. So that's basically saying, hey, here's my adjusted gross income. And then I have below the line deductions, such as itemized deductions or the standard deduction. And it gets a little bit confusing. It's like, well, do I subtract out the $31,000 standard deduction to arrive at my MAGI? No. Okay, so we call it above the line because back in the day, the Form 1040, your AGI was the very last line of the front page, and then you would flip it over, and everything on the next page was below the line, right? Below AGI. So hopefully people enjoyed nerding out about what AGI is and the difference between above the line and below the line. I know I
mean,
did.
I never knew the difference.
Yep.
I'm just like AGI, MAGI, whatever. I file my taxes with one of those programs that tells me what to do.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So it's surprising how much you can learn about the tax code. It sounds dumb, but it's surprising how much you can learn by just like manually filling out the forms. And then every time it says see instruction such and such, just going and reading that form. You just learn so much about the tax code. But anyway, so all that being said, how do we lower our modified adjusted gross income? Well, the most common above the line deductions are really going to be your retirement contributions. So maybe you work at an employer where you still have access to their 401k, but maybe you don't work enough hours to qualify for health insurance, right? Because if you do qualify for health insurance, you're most likely not going to be able to get any subsidy anyway, unless, like what Sam was talking about earlier, the expense is so high that they'll, kind of give you a break on the difference. So for the most part, if you qualify for healthcare through your employer, you're not going to get a subsidy anyway. But if you don't, maybe you're working 20 hours a week, you're still contributing to your 401k, but you are getting healthcare on, the ACA, well, then you can basically use that 401k contribution to lower your AGI, right? All those pre-tax contributions that you do are basically decreasing that modified adjusted gross income. The other thing that you can do is maybe you don't have a 401k, or maybe you just want to contribute more because you've, maxed out that 401k limit. A traditional IRA contribution is also going to be an above the line deduction that is going to reduce your modified adjusted gross income. There are some income limits for contributing to a traditional IRA. However, if you are a person who does not have access to a workplace plan because maybe you have your own business, or maybe you just have like a bunch of side income, like you drive for Uber, or you work part-time at Walmart, or whatever the case is, there is no income limit on deducting your traditional IRA contributions. So like if for some reason you had a side hustle that made $300K a year, you could still deduct that $7,500 traditional IRA contribution for you and for your spouse if you have a spouse. So anyway, a traditional IRA is another way that you can basically get your modified adjusted gross income down. And here's like the magic trick with that is that a lot of your listeners may or may not know, you can actually make the contribution for your traditional IRA, or any IRA really, up to April 15th of the year that you're filing your taxes. So in other words, April 15th, maybe you're filing your taxes next year, 2026. You can say, oh man, I really want to back contribute my 2025 contributions. You can do that. And the cool thing is that you'll have all your tax documents in front of you. You will have pinpointed to the dollar exactly what your AGI is. And maybe you say, holy crap, this 400% federal poverty line cliff is back and I am $700 over the limit. Well, let's do a $701 contribution to my traditional IRA, get myself below that limit. And then you can really dial in your income. So that's actually, if you're a person who thinks that you're going to be close to that 400% limit, or whatever percent you're trying to stay below to get the subsidy that you want, maybe hold off on contributing to your traditional IRA until tax time, until you have an exact idea of how much interest you made, capital gain distributions, dividends, anything that might adjust your modified adjusted gross income. So retirement accounts are really going to be the main way that you can use your modified adjusted gross income. The next thing that you can do is, again, people in the FIRE community often have pretty big brokerage accounts. Most of us, or at least a lot of us, I should say, are doing a combination of selling from our brokerage account to live and doing Roth conversions at relatively low tax rates, because a lot of us are in the 10 or 12% tax rates, and we want to do Roth conversions to take advantage of these low tax rates. You should do some math and figure out, okay, maybe I want to do more of a Roth conversion, but maybe that's going to adjust my MAGI up to a point where I'm no longer going to qualify for a subsidy, or it's going to price me out of the subsidy that I want. Okay. You have to kind of do some math and say, okay, well, maybe I'm converting this at a really low tax rate, and that's great for future growth and everything like that. But if I'm suddenly forced to pay for the next 12 months much higher insurance premiums, maybe the math doesn't really work there. That's another kind of like end of the year thing that I would do is, like, if you're routinely doing Roth conversions, just math that out and see, okay, maybe I want to do a smaller conversion to give myself some more sort of buffer room between that 400% limit. The other thing that you can do is, most people have other accounts. Like, they might have an HSA that they contributed to, which you can withdraw from at any time to cover medical expenses, even if those medical expenses happened in the past. Unfortunately, you cannot use the A to pay your healthcare premiums. That's something you cannot do. Maybe, I mean, the government is like pretty liberal on what they define as like healthcare costs. Like if you bought Band-Aids or something like that, like maybe that's $4 that you can like deduct out of there. Maybe you're coming up right up to the limit, the MAGI that you're trying to stay under. And you could say, okay, I'm going to actually make a withdrawal from my HSA. It's popular in the FIRE community to say, hey, HSA is great. Let's let that thing ride for as long as possible and use that for future healthcare costs. Well, this might be a reason, if you're going to bump yourself into 12 months of, really high healthcare premiums, this might be a reason to withdraw from your HSA instead of, just paying cash and saving your receipts and allowing that account to continue to grow tax-free. The other thing is that you might want to make a Roth withdrawal. You might have contributions or conversions, money that's available tax and penalty free to withdraw from your Roth. And in a perfect world, all of us let our Roth accounts like ride for as long as possible to get that, future tax-free growth. But again, it might be worth it to do a Roth withdrawal, in lieu of, or in addition to your brokerage account sales, to keep yourself below that modified adjusted gross income. And then the last thing is that, if you're selling from a brokerage account, you can really dial in the amount of taxes that you pay, and specifically the amount of modified adjusted gross income that you report. So if you've ever logged into your brokerage account, When you go to do a sale, there's different methods that you can do, right? For the purposes of calculating the profit that you take, which is the amount of tax you're going to pay. A really common one is just average, right? They're going to take the average of all the different shares that you bought and say, okay, well, the average price of this, ETF that you're selling was $67. Therefore, and now it's selling for 100. Therefore, your profit is an average of $33 per share of this ETF, right? That's the average method. The other two that they'll do is one is called last in, first out. And basically that means that the most recent one that you purchased, that is going to be the cost basis. It's going to sell those shares first, which is most likely the most expensive ones with the smallest amount of profit. First in, first out is the opposite, right? That's the earliest ones that you bought. It's going to sell those shares first because you probably bought shares at, varying times throughout your working career. So the cool thing is that you can really dial in. You can look and pick out the individual lots, which is really what you want to do. You want to go in and say, okay, I bought 7 shares of this ETF in December of 2020, and then I bought another 9 shares in January of 2021. Really look and see, okay, which shares do I want to sell so that I can get enough cash to fund my life, but also make sure that I'm staying below a specific MAGI. And that doesn't necessarily mean paying the lowest amount of taxes every year, because maybe you have a year where you're real far below the 400% poverty line and you've got a lot of room. Maybe you actually want to sell some of the higher profit shares so that you can basically let the other lower profit shares, stay there for future needs. In case maybe next year your expenses are more and you need to get a lot more cash, you're not locking yourself into an even larger profit from your, earlier purchase ETFs. If you're a person that's like coming up close to that 400% poverty line limit, you really should not be doing LIFO or FIFO or average. You should really be picking individual lots so that you can manually, dial in the taxes that you pay. The other really cool thing about picking individual lots is that you may actually have some losses in there because maybe you bought some shares that have since gone down. You can actually get, a bunch of cash out and pay 0 taxes because you sold this for a gain and this for a loss. There's a whole separate wash sale thing that, we can discuss, but that's a way that you can actually pay a lot less tax by selling some losses and some gains.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot that we can do. I remember before we started recording, you're like, there's not that much we can do, but you listed like 5 things. So that's pretty good. Yeah. And just for anybody who doesn't know what FIFO and LIFO is that first in, first out, and then last in, first out? Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, good. Because I was like, what does that mean? David, I'm going to throw something at you, though, which I know I didn't prep you for, but I did want to talk about this. And I do think that there are people who are listening to this podcast who maybe just found the FI community and they are, don't have a ton of money yet. I actually know somebody, the guy who I interviewed who's coming out next Monday, he only found the FI community like 8 months ago. So he's in the accumulation phase. He doesn't have a lot of money. I don't know what his insurance what he does for insurance, but he could be on the ACA and this cliff might be looming for him. So what would you say for somebody who may come to you and say is a gig worker and isn't necessarily in the FI community or just found FI and this expense is about to happen for them and it's going to go up by a lot? Like, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, that's really tough. What I would say is this, like if you're in the accumulation phase and you are having to purchase your own plan off the ACA because you don't get it through your employer, this is one of those tough situations where there's just not a lot that you can do. I think that the most important thing, and if they're on the fire path, they're probably working on doing this anyway, but the most important thing is to create a really big buffer between what you make and what you spend. And this applies to kind of all things in life. Back when inflation was like really taking off in 2022, I talked with this service member who came into the organization that I was working for to get a loan. Basically, that's the organization gave loans to service members who were like needing money because they couldn't pay their rent or whatever. This guy, he started kind of ranting about like politics and inflation and everything like that. And, he was living right on the edge of what he made. He was well paid. He made, I mean, relatively well paid. He was, making 70,000 a year, but he was living right on the edge of his income. He was spending 70,000 a year. And that included living out of state. He worked in Virginia, but he drove home to North Carolina because the land was, the land deals were better out there. So he had a big giant yard. Obviously, he had a mortgage. He had a wife and 3 kids, and the wife was a stay-at-home mom. He had 2 car payments, right? Both brand new cars. You know what I mean? And he also had a payment on his rider lawnmower, which he needed because he had a huge plot of land. So this guy was like kind of leveraged to the hilt and spending all of his income. So then what happened in 2021 or 2022, gas prices started going up, okay? And grocery costs started going up. And those are 2 categories that he spends a lot of money in. So this guy was looking at this and he was like, kind of complaining about political things or whatever. And in my mind, I was thinking, like, yes, it's unfortunate that this is happening. And I do feel for you, but you put yourself in this position. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing that says that you must live 60 miles away from work. There's nothing that says that you must drive a $75,000 truck on car payments. There's nothing that says that you should get the biggest mortgage that you can. And I'm not trying to like, victim blame or anything like that. But I mean, it's an unfortunate problem of people living right up to their their incomes. And then anything that happens, whether it's their fault or not, kind of pushes them over a cliff. And it's sad to see, but it's the existence of a lot of people. So my hope is that generally speaking, people in the fire community, they tend to be people who either already are living on a lot less than they make or are in the process of reducing their expenses. Unfortunately, the only thing they can really do is make sure that there's enough of a buffer so that people on the show are not going to be able to see my hand motions, but my left hand is much lower than my right hand. My left hand is expenses, my right hand is income. When my expenses go up beyond my own control because somebody raised my rent or they decreased my subsidy or they increased my health insurance costs, you want to make sure there's enough of a buffer in there that it can absorb it. And maybe the worst thing that happens is that you decrease your savings rate a little bit. Outside of that, I mean, there's just not a whole lot that you can do, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And yeah, I put him on the spot, guys, for asking him that because we mainly were talking about what people in the FI community who have already fired or are well on their way. I wanted to bring it up because I know that there are people who are in this community and, have found it from other places. And so I know that they probably just found FI and they want to be on the FI path. So I feel for them. And I will say there's some things you can control and there's some things you can't control. And this is one of those things that you really can't control except through like who you vote for, of course. Like we have some control over that. And I'm not going to tell you guys who to vote for, but I'm sure some of you guys know my my stance on that stuff. But barring that, you voted for the person who maybe wouldn't have done this and they didn't win. So now you're in this crappy situation that you have to deal with this that you didn't choose. Okay, but you do have control. Like this guy David was talking about. He had the control of living in a big house, having 2 brand new cars, having a lawnmower like that. Like he had control over all of those things. And so those are the levers that you can pull. Just look at the levers that you can control and hopefully that will reduce some of the anxiety. I know for me, I have generalized anxiety disorder and planning helps me calm down. And if you can do the planning that David mentioned, and if you can pull the levers that you actually have control over, then hopefully this won't be as scary.
If you're in the fire community, I do understand and empathize with like how stressful this can be, and it seems really scary. What I will say is that oftentimes when you look at your numbers and you actually plug in, okay, what are the new premiums going to be that I'm paying, and the subsidies and everything that I'm receiving, what are those going to be, and how does that affect me? Is this actually going to derail my plans? I think that in general, the answer is probably no. And don't get me wrong, it sucks to have an expense increase and increase by a lot in a short amount of time. We saw this with rents over the past 4 years. It's been crazy. And I definitely acknowledge that it sucks and it's not fun to have to pay a new bill or a higher bill. But chances are you're probably going to be okay. And you do have more control than like the average, person out there because of your, various sources of money that you can pull from that are taxed in different ways. So don't let this like bring you down. This is just another kind of line item. Mark Troutman in the community, I'm pretty sure he gets no subsidy at all just because he's done an incredible job of saving. And so he's not able to get himself, I think, below, 400% of the federal poverty line. And he described it. He said, this is a couple of years ago, so maybe it's gone up, but he said he was paying about $1,000 a month for health insurance. And he said, yeah, I mean, it's just kind of another line item in my budget. So look at your numbers. You're probably doing better than you think you are. And this is not going to derail your plan. It's just going to be really annoying. But, definitely look at some of the methods that we talked about because you might be able to, get your MAGI down to a point where you still qualify for a subsidy.
You can choose what tier or metal tier within the Obamacare, or Affordable Care Act marketplace. You'll see gold plans, silver plans, bronze plans. They'll have different prices, different details. And that is something that you control, is which plan you choose. Admittedly, in some counties, there aren't a lot of options, but At least in some counties, there are options for you to choose from. A bronze plan will often be a little less expensive. And so if you want to try to save a little money on insurance premiums, that is something you control, speaking of things that you have control over. But it is worth being aware of what is the annual out-of-pocket maximum for whatever plan you choose. And hopefully you have at least that amount of money in some kind of emergency fund or something, so that if you are in a worst case scenario, you have the money to cover that if it's absolutely required of you. I do also want to mention that if you're in certain income ranges, then the silver plans will be beefed up a little bit. So that obviously is something that can be a little difficult to check. But in certain income ranges, the silver plans have, for example, a lower deductible or a lower out-of-pocket maximum for the year. And so that's worth just peeking at the silver plans, and usually it'll be calculated for you automatically. But if you notice silver plans, for some reason, have a much lower deductible, then it might be that, okay, I'm just in that range and the computer has figured that out for me. And it might be better to pick the silver plan just because I get so many more benefits. So that's definitely worth considering. And finally, I will mention, just since I happen to be in Mexico at the moment, that if you do happen to be fortunate enough to have the flexibility to choose where you receive your health care, there are many places on earth that are much less expensive than the United States to receive health care. I think Mexico's national system here costs me about $50 a month. No deductibles, no copays, just covers all medical care that one might need. Pretty simple. And I think many countries also have pretty simple options that are just not as complex to navigate as the United States. But, your mileage may vary.
Yeah, we should do something like that. What the heck?
I know. Yeah. We as in the United States, absolutely.
So I do want to tack on to something Sam said. So two things actually, because you really hit the nail on the head. So don't just pick a bronze. If you're a consumer of healthcare, like you actually go to the doctor relatively frequently, or you have health issues that you're routinely seeing, there's a good chance that the bronze plans are actually not going to save you money because of, it's going to have some very high out-of-pocket maximums, deductibles, and things like that. And so, there are some people who literally max out their out-of-pocket max every year. So if your out-of-pocket max is, say, $1 a year, that's over $500 a month if you average that out. So maybe you're saving $100 a month in the plan, but if you're spending an extra $500 a month in the out-of-pocket expenses, that might not be worth it. The other thing is, if you're a person who's able to keep your income relatively low, I don't remember the exact percentages, but I want to say it's between 150 and 250%. There are something called CSRs, which are cost sharing reductions, right? And that's what Sam was talking about, where you're not just getting an elevated subsidy because of your low income, but you're also getting like a better healthcare plan in the form of lower deductibles, lower out-of-pocket maxes. The friend of mine that I was talking about, she's actually able to get, an out-of-pocket max of something like $1,500, which is crazy. It's much, much lower than the $7,000. And for her, because she is a big consumer of healthcare, this actually makes a big difference. So Google, ACA cost sharing reductions and figure out if you can get your income down to a point where you can actually take advantage of those, because that could save you a ton of money, specifically if you are a person who routinely goes to the doctor and consumes a lot of healthcare. If you're like me and you go once a year for a checkup, it's probably not going to make much of a difference because you never even come close to hitting your out-of-pocket max.
Yeah, David, I actually have a clarifying question on that because my husband and I, obviously next year, we are pretty sure that our healthcare expenses are going to go up because I am going to be pregnant, crossing my fingers. Embryo transfer day is on December 18th, by the way. So everybody send all the really good vibes on that day. This episode is going out on December 15th. So anyway, so hopefully that works and I'll be pregnant and I will be having a baby. And that's expensive because, we make everything expensive in America. And so, but we kept the HSA plan that he's on. We didn't go to the other plan that he has that was like, less expensive or like more premiums, but lower like out-of-pocket max. However, when we looked at it, and I will say I did not math this out or anything. I just kind of was like, well, with the HSA, we get such great tax benefits that I think it's going to be, 6 of one, half dozen of the other type of thing. And I would rather just do that and keep the access to the HSA and just put money in that and then just pull it out again. And that's like, paying for our stuff. So I guess, would you recommend doing something like that? Like if you have access to an HSA with the plan that's like a lower premium but higher out-of-pocket max?
So this is something that depends on the specific details of what you're comparing. To be HSA eligible, you need to have a high deductible plan officially. However, I will say that what is like I've seen employers that offer non-HSA eligible plans that are therefore not high deductible according to the government definition, but actually have higher deductibles and the so-called high deductible plan on the HSA. On the other hand, of course, there are plans, that are going to actually have lower deductibles. And so I think this just really heavily depends on what you're comparing to what. I'm sure David has thoughts as well.
Yeah, and Megan, I'm going to give you my favorite answer, which it absolutely depends on many, many factors. Megan's laughing right now. That's actually an outstanding question because, okay, so for the listeners who aren't aware, an HSA is a health savings account that you can get if you have a high deductible health plan, like what Sam was talking about. The advantage of an HSA is that it's sort of double tax advantage. You contribute into an HSA and you get a federal tax deduction and it's most likely a state tax deduction, depending on your state. But you also get to take the money out tax free if it's spent on medical expenses. So it's kind of a magic trick. You get the tax deduction and you get to pull it out tax free. For somebody in your specific situation where you're going to have one income, which is your spouse's, and then you're going to have a child, which qualifies you for the child tax credit, which I think goes up to $2,200 next year. Your taxable, like your effective tax rate is probably not going to be super duper high, Megan. And so I would question the benefit. Sorry, there's certainly a benefit to the HSA, right? Like I'm going to make up numbers. Let's say that you're in the 22% marginal tax rate and, another 4% for your state. So that's 26% that you're saving to put in, the HSA contribution and get that deducted. And so what is that? 26%. And then the HSA max 2026 is going to be $87.50 for family coverage. Okay. So if we math that out, that's a savings of about $2,275. So the question you have to kind of ask yourself is like, okay, how much healthcare are you going to be using? Are there services that you're going to be using that are covered by the higher cost plan that is not HSA eligible, that would not be covered by your high deductible plan? And you kind of have to math out like, okay, well, on average, how much am I going to the doctor? How much am I going to be going to the doctor because I'm, doing this pregnancy? I would question if the $2,275 of tax savings is necessarily worth the lower cost plan if, you're going to have more out-of-pocket expenses, or more importantly, if there are things that are covered in the higher cost plan. So again, it's a very individual decision. This is like a really easy question to ask if like all you do is go once a year for a checkup. It's like just buy the cheapest plan for the most part, right? You just want it kind of for like, hey, I get, hit by a bus or something and I'm going to max out my out-of-pocket the first day and, it doesn't really matter. But for you, I mean, pregnancy is one of those things that so many complications can arise. I would just really look at, okay, what is covered with this higher cost plan? Because I would question whether or not the HSA is going to save you more money than the additional services that you might have to provide, or pay for with the lower cost plan.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it's kind of too late now, but I wanted to ask the question because I think it's good for people who, maybe are choosing plans to think through that, my knee-jerk reaction was get the HSA plan because we've heard, ooh, triple tax benefits, it's going to be so much better. But it really, as David loves to say, it really does depend, and you actually might get a better, coverage with something that doesn't have an HSA. And yeah, you just forego it for a year or two, however long you have the healthcare costs. I will let you know, David, because from what I remember, now I also want to qualify this. This is an employer plan. This is not an ACA plan, but ACA plans you can look at them the same way. There's some that are high deductible and have HSAs and some that don't. But I think we looked at it and I think the out-of-pocket max and the premiums were like not that much different between the two, which was weird to us. We were like, why is this not that different? I think it was like the out-of-pocket max or the more expensive one was like $1,500, $2,000 less than the other one. And then the premium was like $25 more or something, or like $50 more or something like that. I don't remember, but yeah. And so we were like, it did feel kind of the same, which I thought was a little odd, but anyway, that's my
Yeah.
own.
Yeah. I mean, I would say if you're doing kind of an apples to apples comparison and it really is that close, then yeah, I would take the, $2,300 tax savings. And it also gives you more control of that money, so. But yeah, it's just really tough. And it's tough to know what your healthcare expenses are going to be for next year. A friend of mine was pointing out that, depending on how much healthcare you use, the silver plans are often the cheapest ones because they come with much lower, out-of-pocket expenses, especially if you get the CSR, silver plans. So yeah, it's a good question. I just need to know what healthcare costs you're going to have next year. And then I can tell you which is the best plan to select. So just let me know.
So you need to know the future.
Exactly. This is like, when should I take Social Security? Well, just tell me when you're going to die, and then we'll,
When are you going to
do some
die?
quick math. Easy peasy. I don't know why people make such a big deal about it.
Yeah, that was my biggest pet peeve of Die with Zero. It was like, oh yeah, I mean, as long as you know when you're gonna die, then you know exactly the amount of money you can spend and Die with Zero with. I'm like, yeah, it's that easy, bud.
Yeah.
I don't know, it just annoyed me.
Sam, can you talk a little bit more? Because it sounds like you've used a decent amount of healthcare in other countries, specifically Mexico, where I understand you're a citizen or a resident there.
Resident of
Resident.
Mexico.
Can you
Yes, and
talk?
I am in the process of getting my permanent residency this week. Been a temporary resident until now.
Oh, very cool. Can you talk more about like what has been your experience in paying? I assume you pay cash for your healthcare services in Mexico, and can you talk about like the quality of it? Because I know there's a lot of like people who are like, yeah, you can get it cheaper in other countries, but they're probably going to be using unsterilized instruments or something. What's been your experience?
So I have done both. I've used private medical facilities in Mexico, and for these, I can either pay cash or use private health insurance. Obviously, private Mexican health insurance for Mexican healthcare. But I have also used public medical facilities in Mexico, and as a temporary resident, I can voluntarily enroll in something that is a little bit like their version of Medicare. Of course, there's no minimum age for their equivalent of Medicare because they have universal medicine, unlike the United States. So I've done both, and it's very interesting, but obviously it's a kind of a big topic. So I couldn't possibly cover everything. What I will say is that your private hospitals in Mexico are going to be pretty similar, except perhaps with fewer patients than the corresponding private hospitals in the United States, where they might look like like art galleries, with pretty pictures on the wall and fancy amenities, and the doctors are going to have plenty of time for you and so on in private medical facilities, and they will have similar training to the doctors you might find in Mexican public health care. But of course, because the medical education system is not identical to the United States, it's unlikely that the doctors are going to be identical to the doctors here, although some may have had some medical training outside of Mexico. But that's not always a bad thing. For example, those who are trained at public universities in Mexico have a 7-year medical training program before they get their MD, whereas in the United States it's only 3 years. And so that 7th year is a year of national service, where they will be sent to underserved areas, perhaps in the hinterlands or in the desert, small villages, where they might be the only medical personnel on staff. And that year of kind of volunteer medical experience is part of their way of paying back, in a sense, the government for the heavily subsidized, inexpensive medical school that they will have experienced. Unlike the United States, say, where medical school might be very expensive. So I actually had friends who became doctors that told me, I actually decided to become a doctor because I was thinking of being an engineer, but then I thought, but medical school is almost free. I better go to medical school and it'll be more financially efficient than becoming an engineer and paying that higher tuition. In exchange, I can do a year of service, but that's at least not coming out of my wallet. And then the 6th year, they might have an internship before they do that 1 year in the hinterlands. They might have a year where they're working closely with a doctor to really be trained in the middle of things and see, like an apprenticeship, really see how things go. And then the 5 years before that, they're kind of learning it 3 ways. They're kind of learning it the way the textbook tells them how to do medicine. And then they're learning how their instructor tells them how to do medicine, which may be slightly different from the textbook way. And then they might be learning how to do medicine if you're in a rural area and you don't have adequate equipment. What's the best you can do? So they really have pretty versatile training in the public medical schools in Mexico. They also have private medical schools, which are more variable in exactly what they include and how they do it. So it can be pretty complicated, but I have found that the public system here to be pretty efficient in the sense that they might have to handle 100 million people going through a public medical system. And so it's just different from what you would find in the United States. For example, maybe in the United States, I want to do a urine test, okay, right? Standard thing. So they give me a cup, I pee in the cup, they do an analysis, boom, I know something. Well, in the public system in Mexico, unlike the private system, they might have, thousands of people, wanting to pee in cups all the time and process that really fast. So they're not going to provide the cups to everyone. It's just too complicated and expensive. And so you provide your own cup. And you just got to kind of learn that that's part of the way that their process has been made more efficient by you provide your cup, you pee in your own cup, and you give them that, and they process the results really fast. But the way they do that speed is sometimes in ways that you might not like if you're used to a certain way of doing things in the United States. But, if I'm paying $50 a month and all my medical care is included, no deductibles, no copays, then I might be willing to, spend $1 on a cup and pee into my own cup. And I get my medical results, maybe faster than in the US. And so everything is pros and cons. And also there are a lot of preventative care or preventive care, depending on your choice of words, in Mexico that are amazing, but that many people just don't make use of because maybe they wait until they've actually broken a bone or experience, a real serious medical issue to go to the doctor, but that are available for anyone who wants them. For example, I can see a nutritionist for free through the public medical system in Mexico, or I could get a dental cleaning for free, or do a variety of things that not everyone makes use of. And so that's part of why the medical care here can sometimes be really surprisingly good, is that they have a lot more things available than a typical person will use. But that means they actually have people on staff that can do things for you if you have the time and interest at no additional cost. So that's pretty cool. But I will say that unlike in the US, medical care in Mexico is basically a kind of partnership between the cities and the federal government. And so that means that if you have a very well-managed city, your medical care can also be well managed. And if you have an extremely corrupt little town that you've happened to find yourself in, likewise, the medical care may be suffering in either equipment or other ways. So that's just the nature of going to a different country with a different system. There may be parts of it that work amazingly well, but there may be parts of that country or parts of that system that just don't function the way you would hope for. Yep. So that was my thoughts on Mexico specifically.
Sam, you were muted that whole time.
No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't.
Kidding.
No, he wasn't.
No, that was great. That was a great explanation. And I actually didn't know a lot of that. It makes me, even though I'm not a socialist, I love capitalism to Megan's chagrin. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. All of that sounds awesome. I'm like, why can't we do that? We're like the most richest country in the world. What the heck? Yeah, that's really cool. I guess like it would be tough because like if you had, because on one hand you say, yeah, let's just go to another country and, pay cash for the healthcare that's actually affordable or whatever. But like there's some things that happen that like, you wind up in the ER. You can't be like, hey, can you like bust me down to Mexico real quick so I can like pay less? You're just kind of.
Yeah. And then the travel to the country also
Sure.
costs money too. So
There was
to think of like
yeah.
I doubt you'd want to travel to Mexico to go get your teeth cleaned, right? It's probably cheaper to just pay cash here in the United States to get your teeth cleaned.
Yeah.
Right, definitely.
So there was somebody on one of the 5 podcasts like several years back, and he was talking about I think it was Mexico that he went to, and no, sorry, that was a different guy. He did talk about how the dental care was great in Mexico and how the X-ray machines were the exact same ones that he was using at his dentist in like Texas or wherever he was from. But I know there was another person, it was a couple, and they were pregnant, and they actually went down to maybe Costa Rica or one of those countries. And, they decided to have the baby there, and they figured out that like, because of their like crappy health insurance in America, it was cheaper to go down there and stay in like a nice hotel for a month and then, recover for a little while afterwards and pay cash for the delivery there. It was cheaper to do all that than it was to just use their health insurance in America. And then their baby also got dual citizenship between Costa Rica and the United States. So they were like really kind of talking it up. And I don't know, I haven't used healthcare services in other countries. I haven't really used it in the US very much either, but I don't know, I don't know what we're doing wrong. I don't understand why it's got to be so expensive. And yeah.
Preach. I'll make you a
Well,
socialist.
I will
Okay.
say that in some countries it can be very challenging, even though I've had good experiences in Mexico recently. I mean, in I believe March of this year, I had a little motorcycle accident in the Philippines. I have some very light scars here and here that maybe you can't see over video, and obviously any listeners can't see with their ears. But I found it to be very challenging to navigate the Filipino medical system, even though they spoke English. It's one of their several official languages. Even though they spoke English, I found it to be extremely difficult to navigate in a variety of ways, their medical system. For example, I had to go to the surgeon to contract with him and pay him cash to actually do the surgery. But then the hospital was like, oh, your hospital bed's not included. You need to go to our lodging department if you want to have a hospital bed to sleep in after your surgery. And then I did that, and then my surgeon was like, by the way, you need to provide the titanium plate that's going to go into your arm. Like, I provide my expertise as a surgeon. I don't provide the actual the titanium plate we need to insert into you, I had to like go into the street, find a titanium supplier, pay them a significant fee in cash. It felt like a drug deal, like, hey, you got any titanium, bud? And so it was really wild
You have to put
compared to
this in
my
the podcast.
experiences.
Oh, I am. Let him finish.
Compared to my experiences in Mexico or the US or South Korea, where I was injured last year, a different injury, very, very much up to you. Do it yourself, kind of putting together your medical package. It was not user-friendly at all. And on top of all that, they were like, we don't know if we have enough nurses, so you need to provide a caregiver for your whole stay in the hospital yourself. And so I had to go on Facebook, type in like caregivers of Dumaguete, the city where I was going to have the surgery, and just hire, a random stranger. And I hope, she wasn't a prostitute, but who knows, the credentials can be fake, right? So who knows? But it was a wild and challenging experience every step of the way. I had great nursing care when I had nurses, and I had a good surgeon, but it was just a very challenging system for me to navigate as someone without the kind of cultural context and familiarity with how they did things in that specific country.
Yeah. I'm actually very happy that you said that because medical tourism, it's a whatever you want to do. Like anybody who's listening, like make your own decisions. But there are some realities to it that are going to be different than, getting healthcare in a country like the United States or maybe even in Europe and Mexico too. Like there are some countries where it's just not. It's not that they're not trained well, but you have to do what Sam just said. Like you have to kind of cobble together your own. And if you're like really sick or in an accident where like, say you have like, what if you had like brain damage or something and weren't able to actually do this? Like so it's one of those things that, if you have maybe a surgery that's not as difficult to do and you want to get it done for a little bit cheaper, then go to another country. But if you have an emergency, I think sticking to what the United States has is probably better for you. I'm not going to that's what I would do personally. It sucks that a bill would like totally derail all of our plans probably if they have one person out of network. So yeah. But anyway, we are solidly over an hour in. I think we've given people a lot to think about. We have warned them about the credits going away at the end of the year. And so, yeah, I hope we've given you guys enough to, do something, plan something, and hopefully have eased a little bit of your mental anxiety about this. So thanks, Sam and Dave, for being on. And yeah, see y'all later. Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a quick rating. Also, hit up my Patreon at patreon.com/everydayphi-podcast for ad-free and bonus content coming in 2026. I'm Megan Combs, and I'll see you next time on Everyday Phi.